Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another Rafael at Home event. My name is Tano Maida, and I'm hosting tonight filmmaker Haydn Reiss, whose film Robert Bly, A Thousand Years of Joy, is now streaming at Rafael at Home. If you have had a chance to see it, wonderful, but it will be streaming for at least a week, and there are quite a few other films streaming on the Rafael at Home site. You can get there at rafaelfilm.org, and you can scroll down. You'll see that there are a large number of films up there available right now, and there are some films coming your way very soon. Next week, in fact, they have a film called The Rabbi Goes West, which is going to have a live event on Sunday, a week from today, in the evening, and that will be one of those special Rafael at Home events that is live, but the films are streaming anytime you want. Once you get a ticket at rafaelfilm.org, you can stream that film anytime within the following 48 hours. Tonight, we're going to talk about Robert Bly. And, it's interesting. We have Haydn Reiss with us, and this, I believe, is your third Rafael at Home event in just a month, and they've all been about poets, Rumi, Ferlinghetti, and now Robert Bly. Maybe you should help us understand what's your attraction, what is your involvement with poetry?
Well, it's a trifecta on poetry. Well, I mean, I've been in love with poetry for decades, and it's really given my life a lot of extra richness. And so when I started, the first documentary I made in the early 90s was on Robert Bly and his friendship with William Stafford. And I got hooked. I mean, poetry is a type of magic and a type of mystery and alchemy. And especially in times like these, a little good poetry can really help you through.
Well, that's at times like these, we wonder, are these any different than any other times? But before we get too further down the pike here, I want to remind folks at home that if you have a question, there's a little button on the bottom of your screen, and you can type in a question. We'll get to questions as things add up over time, and we'll try and address as many of them as we can later. But do get your questions in as soon as you think of them, and don't worry, you can have more than one question. Anyway, Bly was a prolific writer and poet and editor, etc. And he had many titles, but yet you chose A Thousand Years of Joy
Right.
out of all the choices.
Well, I made the film. I started the film when Robert was in his mid 80s, and I try to move quickly. And I think I got it done by the time he was about 89. And so that poem, there's a poem, that title comes from, which is a poem he wrote in his 80s, not one of his early poems. And it's a beautiful poem in that it is sort of a summary in his beautiful poetic way of his life and the things. And it ends with sort of a review at the end. The last stanza, I think, goes something like, the judge said, "Show us your hands. You're a thief. I showed my calloused hands in court, and my sentence was 1,000 years of joy." So it's interesting, I only recognized later that he didn't show his hands in court. He showed his calloused hands. You only have calloused hands after time and work. So he's saying this as the older man, and through all the hardships and everything that came with his life, he still sees it as 1,000 years of joy. So it's remarkably optimistic, and I think, I don't want to speculate, except that Robert was, Robert's 93, he'll be 94 in December. He always had his head looking towards the stars and the gift of life and what you could do with it.
Well, you quoted him, or he's quoted in the film as saying that poetry is like medicine. And, his work is characterized by a spiritual, it's almost like a transcendence. through it all. But unlike some of his colleagues like Allen Ginsberg and Gary Snyder, he didn't seek another spiritual tradition. He stuck with his Lutheran roots, and
Well, up to a point. I mean, he was. The film has a scene in it when he was, working on the farm. He was a farm boy, Western Minnesota. There were two brothers, and Robert was clearly the one who wasn't going to be a farmer. And because when he was doing the tractor up and down, plowing, he would also try to read poetry. Omar Khayyam is one of the earliest poetic references. And, he got so distracted at one point, he turned the tractor over, and as he says, my father had to come and drag the tractor out and looking at this son, like, what in the world are you doing reading poetry while you're on your tractor? So there was something in him early, encouraged by his mother. And then he just really had a remarkable trajectory going from the Minnesota farm boy to Harvard, to New York City and back. And he's, as we who have read him and respect all that he's brought to our culture, the translations, he's looked over the world to find other poets to bring into English language, including a lot of the mystical, Kabir, Mirabai, Rumi, Hafez. I wouldn't say like which, was he in any camp? I mean, he studied with a Sufi teacher. Buddhism, he go to, a great Christian service. He was, he spread his love around.
Well, you have Gioia Timpanelli saying that, he was engaged in a soul education. And that's something that rings true, because it's not about really studying with the intellect. He was engaging in a very different way. It's obvious from his own poetry, but it's also, as you mentioned, it's obvious from what he was attracted to. And maybe we can look at BLY as having kind of four hats. He was a poet, he was a translator, editor. He was for many people, he was Iron John, and he was also a political activist. And this is interesting because you open the film with him engaged in a very, very political act.
Yeah, when he won the National Book Award for Silence in the Snowy Fields, I think in '63, won a National Book Award. Of course, the Vietnam War was raging, and he went to Lincoln Center in New York, very Tony affair. All the elites of the literature world show up at the National Book Award to accept for best poetry that year. And he used the occasion, I only know what the first few words of his acceptance was, the first words are, I'm a bit uneasy. And he goes on from there to say, I'm uneasy about accepting an award, and we're patting ourselves on the back for our enlightened culture with books and literature. At the same time, halfway around the world, we're bombing these people. I think, and others have speculated, that it's a wonderful piece of writing or an oratory, but it probably precluded him from ever becoming the U.S. Poet Laureate.
Yeah.
As Philip Levine talks about in the film. I mean, so Robert, he also believed, I think, one of his senses was that a poet has various obligations. And, one of those is to be engaged with the things of one's time and to speak to that as best one can. And so he took that on as that just came with being a poet, as the old definition of a poet was understood.
Well, to what extent do you think, and by you starting the film with that act, to what extent do you think his political engagement defined him?
Well, it's funny you bring that up, because so the film opens with this thing about the National Book Award and what happened at the event and the follow-up. That was not up front in the film. That was more like 2/3 of the way back. But interestingly enough, I had shown a rough cut of the film to a woman filmmaker who had been recommended to me as somebody to get some perspective. And she looked at it and she said, she knew who BLY was, but she said, I never really, really sort of felt comfortable with him or liked him. And she watches the film and she said, the rough cut, 2/3 of the way through, she sees what he did, the bravery, the sacrifice. And she says, that's when I started to like him. Because so many people, especially in the 90s, 2000s, had very strong opinions about BLY. And so I wanted to move that up front to get you to not just like the man, but to respect the man and see the sincerity of the stand he took. So that was prompted by feedback from someone, which is similar to when I was making the film. I was at a gathering and I was speaking to someone who was this wonderful therapist woman from New York City. And she said, what are you doing? And I said, well, I'm making this film about Robert BLY. And she looked back, she said, well, isn't he a misogynist? And I said, you know what, I'm making the film for you. Because you've never read BLY. You've read some snarky, pieces in Time magazine, but the film is gonna help. And I've had that experience with the screenings. I can't tell you how many women have come up to me afterwards and really thanked me for sort of showing a fullness of who Robert really is. Because the Iron John period of time in the men's work led to a lot of misinterpretation.
Well, now you bring it up, this Iron John work, how do you see this, we'll call it, project of his in terms of his life story and his background and how it was integrated into his other selves, his other hats?
Yeah, but I don't want to forget that I just have to say a few people. The film was done with luck and prayer. I was raising the money during the making of it. My friend here, Tana, was one of the associate producers. Also Jennifer Nix and Jim Lenfesti. I want to thank Mark Traver, a dear friend who was a DP unpaid. And last but not least, Dominic Howes in Minnesota, who sort of stepped into my life just when I thought the project was going to stall. And he helped us get over the hump and get it done. That said, well, again, I'm only speculating. It's all through the filter of my own experience and reading. I think Robert, like a lot of us, had complicated relationships with his father. His father was a very hardworking farmer, rather taciturn, alcoholic, moods, and all that. And I think it, affected Robert. There's about 3 or 4 times in the film when we return to that relationship, which evolved over time. In fact, there's a beautiful little poem, I'd read it for you if you want, that Robert wrote probably in his 80s, because the book came out in 2011, where he writes about his father from the perspective of being the old man and could see things that the young man couldn't see about who his father was. Very beautiful. So I think a lot of us in the men's work and the gatherings were, really, that was a primary thing about it, the relationship one had with one's father. And if you were a father or thinking of being a father.
Well, in terms of for him though, did you get a sense when working with BLY and filming him, in reference to the Iron John work, that he felt that it was something that he completed, that he accomplished what he set out to accomplish, or that it had some effect on his poetry, etc.?
I really couldn't speculate on that. I think it had about a 10-year run when Robert and mythologist Michael Meade and the late Jungian renegade James Hillman went crisscross the country and did these wonderful gatherings and events, and with music, live music, and they were fantastic. And they ran for about 10 years, and then things changed, and the 3 of them no longer did these events. And I remember interviewing Michael Meade, because in the thick of the run, it felt like this could go on forever. These were some of the greatest evenings I've ever been to. And Meade himself said, I didn't know at the time how rare it was that the 3 of us could come together at a period of time and find such tremendous reception to what we wanted to put out there, and do what they did. So but Robert never stopped writing. He's gone in periods where he's more forward and in the world, and then also he needs solitude. Silence in the Snowy Fields is the name of his first book. There's no human beings mentioned in the book, so that back and forth. Yeah. Let me to complete that. I don't think Robert had a specific agenda. I mean, I know he didn't go in there with a plan. It just all evolved. He had started something called the Conference of the Great Mother, maybe 25 or 30 years ago, where they would study a lot of mythology, and Joseph Campbell would come to these gatherings and looking at the stuff of the archetype of the Great Mother, etc. Then he added the New Father, and these gatherings were once a year. And he said that he noticed after a decade or so that the women seemed to be doing rather well, but the men were still struggling. And that's when he sort of turned his focus to how to help the men. And when he found the Grimm's fairy tale Iron John, he saw a structure, a template in which to tell all that he wanted to say around that within the weaving of this story of Iron John.
Do you have a poem for us?
Well, I was saying to you that when later in his life, he wrote the poems about his father are quite different than the poetry from when he was younger writing about his father. But this one, again, in his 80s, this is from the Talking into the Ear of a Donkey. It's my father at 40. I loved him so much. I've said that before, so don't be surprised. It was a first love. Go ahead, open your hand. Do scissors beat paper? Does rock beat scissors? It's just love, and it can't be explained. Probably happened early. You're looking at it. The way I found of opening a poem, I took from the way he walked into a field.
Nice piece.
What a remark to say that, to start a poem, of course, that's been most of his life, but he drew something from seeing his farmer father do his poetry in the fields. I mean, it's so beautiful.
Let's take you're thinking about fathers.
Yeah.
Well, let's the follow-up to Iron John for BLY was this book, Sibling Society, and I know you've been a champion of this book. It wasn't as successful as Iron John, but it may very well be more to the point of the moment that we're experiencing now, in this issue of a vertical transmission of wisdom and awareness and mentorship, versus a horizontal kind of society that has evolved here, particularly in the West. But also, we've just lost a slew of great elders. I mean, John Lewis just 2 days ago, Milton Glaser a few weeks ago, let's not forget Carl Reiner. Some of the giants of a generation are leaving us.
Yeah, I know. And that we've talked about that. And what happens, of course, is when these great teachers or mentors, leave us, then I always feel then it's asking us to get stronger, right? I mean, now we have to hold up the world,
This guy, yes.
And this guy. So Sibling Society came 2 or 3 years later. The Iron John was an unbelievable out of the blue success, and of course they always want you to follow up. And he found another fairy tale, this Jack and the Beanstalk, to build around. But this one dealt with really what he saw in, all the hundreds of readings he's given across the country, the touring during the Iron John, what he saw sort of as the vanishing adult, or the vanishing adult energy. The energy that would look to the past to draw from and use that wisdom, the ancestors. This is the vertical line from the past into the present, into the future. And what he saw was a rise in what he called sibling, the horizontal, where you don't look to above, right? Or the past. You just look side to side to see what your peers are thinking. And so he later said that the title, The Sibling Society, wasn't the best title because you'd think brother, sister. He said a better title would be The Society of Half Adults. So, and his point was, when the adults don't want to be adult, what do the children see? What do they have to model? So they don't have anything lifting them up towards where they're headed into adulthood. And right, the book is prescient in that way, that when you lose that sense of a continuity from the ancestors to the future and all this, what are you left with? It's something very flat. And
no depth.
And it gets even grimmer because, you know, that without direction, you'll see a real regression to very primitive ways of being that we would have hoped that we would have proceeded past. But the book made no traction. It was just ignored because I think it was a little too prescient and a little too in your face, you know.
Well, it may also have been a little in front of its time. You know,
Yeah.
he saw things over the horizon, and we're now living it. And certainly, the pandemic has heightened awareness of this lack of respect for authority, knowledge, science, consideration of your neighbors, your family, et cetera. Only sort of kind of a knee-jerk response to limits on your freedom. So that book would be instructive now.
Yeah, I reread it recently. I wish I had the first page of it, because the first page is a terrific little summary. I mean, you know, the tyranny of a type of narcissism that we see rampant, and you know, the me first sense of things, the sense that I have no obligations to a larger community. The community is given a lot of lip service. You know, the real actions people are doing in their lives. It's not 100%. There's a lot of amazing, wonderful things being done, and this is true. But he I think he's not a public person anymore. He doesn't make, you know, write pieces, but I think he would be he'd be, you know, concerned and maybe worried. He has children, but like I say, Robert was back to 1,000 Years of Joy. You know, he got the Robert Frost Medal in New York City, I think in 2012 or 13. And to get that award, you had to show up to receive it, and you had to give a little reading. So I went thinking, oh, we're still getting footage. And so we get to this event, and it's very crowded, and Robert's the final speaker after a whole bunch of, you know, other awards, but small ones. The big one is the Robert Frost. And the room was packed, and I had been able to squirrel myself in the back with my cameraman, and we had ran this cable all the way up 50 feet to the microphone, and I'm waiting to get it. And Roberts gets up slowly to the podium, and his daughter says, Robert, maybe you should sit in a chair. And he does, and with that, somebody rips the microphone away and disconnects my cord. And the evening has already gone long. And I would have had to kind of go under the 50, you know, chairs ahead of me and get nobody's going to let me do this. So now I'm going to get no picture, no sound. And I've come to New York for this. And I just said, oh my God. And, and so then Robert sits down, and his voice isn't big and strong, but it's clear enough. And he reads like about 7 or 8 poems, and they're wonderful. It's like the sky above this building opens up, because there was a lot of poetry that was kind of small souled, you know what I mean? And then Robert kind of opens up the room. And at one point, he says, he looks up, he says, do you think it's getting late? You know, and I look around, I see these New Yorkers checking their watch, you know, it's a late evening. And he wasn't talking about the time of day. He was talking about where we are and things. And he said, you know, I think this whole thing, this whole world is just getting started. And it blew my mind that a man who's in his 80s, who instead of thinking like, you know, when I go, it should all go with me, you know, that kind of, or I don't want to go. He basically said to us, you know what, this thing that we're in, it's just getting going. And then he reads a Thousand Years of Joy. And so that was, that's what I got. And that gave me sort of a path about the film. You know, this is what Robert is. So if you haven't seen the film, it's 1,000 Years of Joy. And even though there's pandemics and loss and suffering and grief, Robert had all of that in his life. But he was able to also see all the gifts and you know, and so it's very uplifting to me.
Well, folks at home, if you haven't seen the film, it is streaming at rafaelfilm.org, and I highly recommend you indulging in a visit with a very special American character. And they don't make them like this anymore. I mean, Pete Seeger was a similar character, someone who had multifacets to him, had real depth, and grew into a force that had enormous influence on not just one generation, but several generations. Fortunately, both of them have had long lives. Pete's no longer with us, but Robert still is. But the film is there, and I really, if you haven't seen it yet, I invite you to really take some time to take a look. Haydn, are you ready for a couple questions, or do you have anything you'd like us to hear that you've prepared?
The trouble with being around poets is you want to read poetry, and you should read poetry. You know, even if it's just you become shameless. But I just want to leave you with one. It didn't make it into the film, but again, I think it's a great summary. For a while, this was the working title of the film. It was going to be called Gratitude to Old Teachers. Now, he's a Minnesota boy, frozen lakes and snow, and that's the world Robert grew up in. When we stride or stroll across the frozen lake, we place our feet where they have never been. We walk upon the unwalked, but we are uneasy. Who is down there but our old teachers? Water that once could take no human weight, we were students then, holds up our feet and goes on ahead of us for a mile. Beneath us the teachers, and around us the stillness.
Mm.
And you know, I say this about poems, you know, you can read a poem again and again and see something you didn't see before. I've read that poem 100 times, and it was only today, in getting ready, this line, water that could take no human weight. We were students then, right? The frozen lake wasn't frozen, couldn't take the weight of us. We were students, it was water, it was flow, you'd think. You know, so right there, that beautiful using a metaphor to say something about development and maturity and appreciation.
Well, thank you for that poem. Let me read you a question. This will begin the next phase of our little Raphael at Home event. We have a question that says, which California coastal town did BLY and his family live in? The beach in the film looks to us like, go ahead, what was it?
Point Reyes.
Point Reyes, there you go. And everyone who's around here in the Bay Area would recognize it, yeah.
1970. He needed a break from the intensity of all the work with the anti-war movement. He packs the family up and they drive from Minnesota to Point Reyes for a year. And there's a collection called Point Reyes Poems, very lovely.
I have another question, and this is from, this stuff moves. Poetry performance artist and author Kim Rosen says that poetry in ancient times was never meant to be delivered without some form of music or sound to elicit the liminal space, the alchemy between sound and words that brings us into a unique whole experience greater than the sum of parts. question to you is, do you believe that we've lost our way into obsession with the linear, rational, cognitive mind by losing our allegiance to this awareness now, especially when so many of us are caught in the imprisonment of words rather than the liminal space beyond words? It's a bit much for a question, but
Yeah, I mean, I get the gist. Yeah.
Robert, how Robert related to
Well,
sound music.
who knows with Robert? Here's what I would say. Yes, it is true, I guess, that in different cultures that, music would accompany poetry readings. I mean, what Robert has said, and, Robert, for the first up till maybe mid 80s, 90s, he would travel with a little, the Greek instrument, the bouzouki. And he couldn't really play it very well. If you were around in those days, it was great. But he'd hit just one minor note and then start doing, a poem and just a little. See, he said that what the music helps is to bring the poem from here to here. That is the benefit, and that's part of it. I'm generous though. Like I feel like if you could get music, great. If you can't get music, poetry is a form of music.
Well, certainly there's a huge difference between reading a poem to yourself in your mind, in your head, and reading or hearing a poem out loud.
Absolutely. Yes. I mean, Robert has said, I think it's in the film, I can't recall, but listen, I mean, we'll take what we can get. I mean, it'd be beautiful to have children have poetry read to them in schools. But if they're gonna, read it in books later, that's good too. It's still good,
Well, speaking of that, there's a request for a comment. The role of William Booth with Robert, especially the little book of The Human Shadow, quote, "Don't read poetry unless you want to change your life."
Well, that's sort of a reference to the Rilke poem, but you must change your life. It's funny that his son, Greg Booth, has a horse ranch in Montana, and I'm on him with Facebook, and he puts all these great horses that they're raising and stuff. And yeah, it's a wonderful book, a little book about the human shadow. It's sort of, the Jungian. Jung was a huge influence on Robert. I mean, the thing about Robert is if you saw all the books he wrote, you'd be, marvel at the range. He has a fabulous book on Thoreau. He's got 2 or 3 books here, obviously mythological. He's got dozens of, so Robert has done a lot and covered a lot of ground. But that is a wonderful little book. He leaves Harvard and he thinks, I'm going to go to New York and become a writer, because that's what you do back then in the 50s. He gets there, can't get any traction. He's got to take menial jobs, house painter, which he's not very good at, and he's living a pretty meager existence. But he says that one of the best things was, if you know New York City, there used to be all these great secondhand bookstores, the Strand, etc. And I don't know, the bookkeeper takes mercy on him and gives him some books, and there were editions of Jung. And he discovers Jung in New York at that time. And it made a profound influence. His wife, Ruth, is a Jungian therapist. But what's cute is after New York, he basically realizes, this New York is not working out. Where can I go? He does like what a lot of us do and a lot of kids would be doing right now. He goes home and he returns to Minnesota. The father has an extra farm, but it's, it's like living at the family house. I mean, but it's a farm. But he's still in this little town of Madison, Minnesota, Lutheran farm community, etc. He starts to hold, free openings about how Jung, what Jung means to the people of Madison, Minnesota. He's giving a little talk about this, which, because when Robert found something that really meant something to him, he wanted to share it. And he didn't say, well, what are these farmer people going to think about Carl Jung? He just said, no, I'm going to go off and talk about it because it's great. His enthusiasm, for what he felt was important is what made a lot of things happen. And he had great taste.
Well, one of the best ways to learn is to teach. So he was keenly aware
That's
of.
absolutely.
I have a little comment for you. It says, great film, Haydn, just watched it the other day. What was your experience being with William Stafford and Robert Bly together?
Yeah, so my first film in '92 was called William Stafford and Robert Bly, A Literary Friendship. Um, I just wanted to be around those guys. I mean, I had been working in some feature films in a little small capacity, and I just got taken by this work of the poetry and the men's stuff. And yeah, Bill and Robert had very different outward appearances and personas, but there was a deep, deep connection. In fact, I remember seeing them side by side at a retreat when Robert brought Bill out to join for a reading, the two men, and they would go back and forth, each reading a poem, like two great jazz musicians trading riffs. And I said, man, if I could be old and be like these guys, maybe it won't be so bad. And yeah, so you'd have to see the film. There's a lot of love. It's just the two of them. I just got out of the way. I couldn't manage those guys. I just said, can you talk about whatever? And they would just go off and talk. And again, they had great respect for each other, differences, a lot of shared feelings. And Kim Stafford is a dear friend of mine, Bill's son, wonderful writer, poet. Just talked to him yesterday. He wrote a poem about being in Oregon and out in the woods and seeing the comet last night. And he read me his comet poem. It was very beautiful. I wish I had it.
Is your film available, Robert Bly and William Stafford, or
Yeah.
pardon me?
Well, okay. So if you go to robertblyfilm.com, robertblyfilm.com, you'll see this film and also a film that I mentioned. Also, Every War Has Two Losers, which has two films on it. Every War Has Two Losers is about Bill Stafford's years as a conscientious objector. Very interesting. You have W.S. Merwin, Maxine Hong Kingston, Alice Walker, a whole host of people on that. And then there's also this William Stafford and Robert Bly literary friendship. Bill was about 10 years older than Robert, and really he was like the older brother. Robert had tremendous admiration for Bill because the sacrifice Bill made, to do 3 or 4 years as a conscientious objector in the camps and doing public service, and standing for what he believed in, and and a terrific poet, fantastic poet.
He's no longer with us.
No, sadly, he actually. I was editing. And we got a call, he was 79, he had a heart attack. In the middle of editing, I had been looking at that man's face for a couple of months. And it was such a staggering, well, let me segue into something little. So we finished that was in I forget, September, October. And we got the film done. And we were supposed to show up in Oregon, in Portland for his 80th birthday. And it was going to be a big event. He's, much loved poet laureate of Oregon, etc. And we go and we screen it, and everybody's there, the Bly family, the Stafford family. And I'm nervous because we had finished it on a Monday, and now it's a Friday. It's my first work. I mean, this is made before nonlinear editing. This is done in the old school way and all that. And I sit down with my editor, and the house goes dark. And what comes up is like one of these, you have to be a little older to know who Steve Reeves, he was a muscle man. He did a lot of gladiator films, and Steve Reeves, and it was one of these on that big Roman ship with all the oars and all these, and I'm thinking, they've put the wrong film up. And then about 2 minutes later, they start to talk, and it's a promo for the Northwest Film Festival. But I was dying because I felt I had everybody's, they were there, they were still in mourning, and the theater puts up the wrong film. That's a message to Dan Zastro. Don't ever do that. And then we showed it, and it was a lot of love in the room.
Well, those are very powerful.
Yeah.
We have another comment here. It's not a question. It says, after being at a weekend workshop in San Francisco at the Masonic with Robert Hillman and Michael Mead in the wake of Iron John, I will never forget what Bly said at one point. It's one thing for a man to be ashamed for reprehensible behavior, but never, ever accept any shame from anyone simply for being a man. That comment changed my life.
I don't want to wade into the deep waters. So, yes, I think a lot of men who wound up at those gatherings were men who well, maybe didn't want to take on what was offered to them, the 1950s man and his, somewhat of how his roles were defined, et cetera, et cetera. And, but what was going to be the role? What kind of, what could masculinity be? And what couldn't it be? And so that was the exploration. And I'm happy that at those times you could have, you could hear a lot of different views without getting, alarmed by something that rubbed you the wrong way. I mean, I had a lot of cognitive dissonance, I'd hear something, but my experience was, men who just really wanted to try to heal or put themselves together and able to be of service to their own families or their communities.
We have a final comment, it looks like, says, I believe and have written that sibling society is the best dominant metaphor of our time.
Well, this thing about the immaturity or the lack of wanting to become mature is a big theme. And I can't quite get my handle on it. We're wrestling with it as we see it acting out every day, To be a grown-up is not a terrible thing. And if you look in the mirror and you are biologically a grown-up, how do you accept that place and try to be, the best you can in that role? And this is this is a big topic.
Well, let's leave it for those who have the time to pursue it in depth, and maybe share with us another poem, because this is Robert Bly is nothing if not a great poet.
And it's so sad. I'm from New York. My voice. You got to hear Robert. Yeah, see the film. He's a presence. He's a presence. So this book that I thought was, like the Rolling Stones, the first few albums, they were great. And then you said, I don't need to get those later albums because they're just rehashing. They're not as good. So I'm making the film when this book comes out. And I'm saying, I don't need that. I got the early books. Those are fine. This is late Rolling Stones. And it wasn't until later that I started to read it. I said, oh my goodness, I love this book even more. And the film opens with a poem from this book called I Have Daughters and I Have Sons. This is called Longing for the Acrobat. There is so much sweetness in children's voices, and so much discontent at the end of day, and so much satisfaction when a train goes by. I don't know why the rooster keeps on crying, nor why the elephant lifts his knobby trunk, nor why Hawthorne kept hearing trains at night. A handsome child is a gift from God, and a friend is a vein in the back of the hand, and a wound is an inheritance from the wind. Some say we are living at the end of time, but I believe 1,000 pagan ministers will arrive tomorrow to baptize the wind. There's nothing we could do about St. John. Wherever he laid his hands on earth, the well water was sweet for 100 miles. Everywhere, people are longing for a deeper life. Let's hope some acrobat will come by and give us a hint of how to get to heaven. Everywhere, people are longing for a deeper life. Let's hope some acrobat will come by and give us a hint how to get into heaven.
Thank you, Haydn Reiss. And thank you for your film, Robert Bly, A Thousand Years of Joy. And it's streaming today and through next week for sure at rafaelfilm.org and among many other selections, of course. But this film, if you have been listening to our little conversation, will be a rich experience for you whenever you get a chance to view it. So please visit rafaelfilm.org and enjoy. Thanks to everyone at the Rafael Film Center soldiering on through the pandemic with great, great class and skill. So thank you all for joining us tonight, and thank you, Haydn, for your time.